You've stopped texting. They've stopped texting. And now you're left sitting in a strange kind of silence that feels heavy, almost unsettling, like you're waiting for something that isn't coming. Your mind starts filling in the gaps. Do they even care that you're gone? Are they finally at peace without you? Or were you never as important in their emotional world as you thought you were? This is where most people misunderstand what mutual no contact with an avoidant partner actually means. It is not simply the end of communication. It is not a clean breakup in emotional terms. What it really becomes is the start of a deeper internal process, one that slowly exposes hidden patterns, emotional wiring, and the real structure of the connection that existed between you. And by the end of this, you'll start to see something very clearly. This silence is not empty, it is revealing. It is showing you who they are when the emotional pressure disappears, and just as importantly, who you are when you are no longer chasing. Right now, while you may be replaying conversations, analyzing tone shifts, and wondering what went wrong, your avoidant partner is likely sitting in a very different emotional state. And surprisingly, it often begins with something most people don't expect: relief. When contact stops from both sides, an avoidant nervous system often interprets that distance as safety. The emotional weight they were carrying, expectations, conversations that felt too intense, moments where vulnerability was required, all of that suddenly drops. The system that was previously activated by closeness begins to settle. From a psychological perspective, avoidant attachment patterns often rely on what researchers describe as deactivating strategies. When emotional intimacy starts to feel overwhelming, their mind and body automatically create distance. It is not necessarily a conscious decision. It is more like an internal regulation system kicking in, where closeness gets coded as pressure rather than comfort. So, when you also step back and stop reaching out, something important happens inside them. The pressure disappears completely. No more emotional demands, no more need to respond, no more expectation of being available in a way that feels draining to them. And in that moment, their nervous system finally exhales. This is why, at first, silence can feel strangely peaceful for them. The emotional alarm system that was previously activated in closeness turns off. There is no immediate distress, no panic, no urge to repair. Instead, there is space, distance, quiet. But this is where the situation becomes more complex than it appears on the surface. In previous cycles of distance between you, there was usually an unspoken safety net. Even if things went quiet, there was a part of them that knew you would come back, you would reach out, you would reconnect, and you would restore emotional balance. That expectation allowed them to stay somewhat detached while still feeling secure in the background of your presence. You were, in a sense, maintaining the emotional bridge. You were the one closing the gap. You were managing the connection while they remained more passive within it. That created a dynamic where they could experience closeness when they were ready and distance when they needed it, without fully losing the relationship. But mutual no contact changes that structure completely. Now there is no bridge being rebuilt, no predictable return, no emotional safety line that quietly guarantees reconnection. And over time, that is where the real psychological shift begins, not immediately, but gradually, as silence stretches longer than their nervous system is used to. Because what starts as relief can slowly evolve into something else. And that shift is where the deeper truth of attachment patterns begins to surface. This is also where you begin to see the difference between genuine emotional growth and the repetition of old patterns in new situations. When avoidant individuals are no longer buffered by predictable connection cycles, their responses start to reveal whether they are actually evolving or simply adapting temporarily to discomfort. And this is the part most people miss. Mutual silence is not about who breaks first. It is about what changes internally while no one is reaching out. It is about whether emotional avoidance turns into awareness or just a pause before the same cycle begins again with someone new. And in that quiet space, without messages, without explanations, and without emotional interference, both sides are being confronted with something unavoidable, not just the absence of contact, but the reality of the connection itself, exactly as it was. When you also stop reaching out, something subtle but powerful begins to shift in a way they don't fully expect or immediately understand. The silence becomes mutual, and with that, the invisible safety net they were unconsciously relying on begins to fade. What once felt like emotional control, predictability, or even quiet stability starts to feel less certain. In the beginning, they may not interpret it as anything significant. That early phase of quiet can still feel comfortable, even relieving. There are no emotional expectations, no pressure to respond, no need to engage in difficult conversations or meet emotional demands. For someone with avoidant tendencies, that absence of pressure can initially feel like space to breathe again. But that comfort is often temporary, because once the familiar pattern of you reaching out, initiating, or maintaining the emotional bridge disappears completely, something inside the dynamic begins to change. The internal system that was used to a certain rhythm of connection and distance starts to lose its balance. What was once predictable no longer behaves the same way. And slowly, without dramatic moments or obvious turning points, the emotional tone begins to shift. At first, that relief starts to lose its softness. It becomes less about peace and more about neutrality. Then gradually, it turns into curiosity, a quiet awareness that something is different. And if the silence continues without interruption, that curiosity can deepen into confusion, an emotional state that is harder to regulate or dismiss. They begin to register your absence in a new way, not just as no messages or no contact, but as a disruption in the expected pattern. You are not reaching out like before. You are not trying to repair, explain, or reconnect. You are not filling the space that they may have unconsciously relied on you to fill. And for someone who is used to emotional distance being temporary, that creates internal questions they were not fully prepared to face. Why hasn't there been contact? Have they moved on already? Did I misread how important I was to them? Why isn't there any reaction from their side? These thoughts don't always arrive clearly or all at once. More often, they surface in fragments, repeating quietly in the background, building emotional tension over time rather than appearing as one sudden realization. On the surface, these moments can look like coincidence or simple friendliness, but in many relational dynamics, they can function as quiet tests rather than full reconnections. Not necessarily tests in a conscious or manipulative sense, but more like emotional check-ins to assess whether access still exists. Not access to your time or attention alone, but access to your emotional availability. Because what is being evaluated is not just whether you are still present in their world, but whether you are still reachable in the same emotional way as before, without them having to fully step into vulnerability, responsibility, or discomfort. In other words, it becomes a way of checking whether the old dynamic can still be reactivated. And this is an important distinction. These subtle reappearances are often less about deep emotional processing in that exact moment, and more about restoring familiarity. There is a desire to see if the connection can still exist in a controlled and predictable form, one where closeness does not require too much emotional exposure, accountability, or internal change. But when that structure is no longer guaranteed, something else begins to emerge underneath the surface. It does not always appear immediately, but over time, a sense of uncertainty can grow, a feeling of reduced control, a disruption in predictability. And beneath that, something more vulnerable begins to surface, the discomfort of not knowing where they stand in your emotional world anymore. Because without your consistent pursuit, they can no longer automatically assume they hold a secure and unchanging place in your attention, your care, or your emotional priority. And that uncertainty can slowly replace the earlier sense of relief. However, while all of this may be unfolding on their side of the silence, something equally important is happening on yours, though it often begins in a completely different emotional state. At first, the silence does not feel empowering. It can feel heavy, confusing, and emotionally charged. Your mind may replay conversations, reevaluate past moments, and search for meaning in things that already happened. There can be doubt, emotional pull, and a strong internal urge to reconnect just to relieve the discomfort of not knowing. It can feel like standing in a space where nothing is fully resolved, and your nervous system keeps trying to pull you back toward familiarity, even if that familiarity was not always emotionally safe or consistent. And yet, even within that discomfort, something gradual begins to form over time, not immediately and not in a straight line, but slowly. As the silence continues, your attention starts shifting away from the constant emotional monitoring of the other person and back toward yourself. You begin to notice the space that opens up when you're not constantly reacting. You start to see how much of your energy was tied to interpreting someone else's behavior. And little by little, the silence that once felt like emotional absence begins to create room for something else: awareness, reflection, and the first signs of emotional separation from the old pattern. And from that point onward, the silence is no longer just about them or the connection you shared. It starts becoming something more personal, something that reflects not only what the relationship was, but what you are slowly becoming outside of it. Your anxious attachment can feel loud in moments like this. It pushes you toward action, toward fixing things, sending a message, doing something to stop the uncertainty, because silence can feel like rejection, and your nervous system naturally wants to restore connection as quickly as possible. But something important often begins to shift when you stop being caught in that constant loop of reaching, interpreting, and overthinking. When you're no longer investing all your energy into decoding their moods, their distance, or their inconsistency, a different kind of space starts to open up. At first, it's subtle. You don't necessarily notice it as healing right away. It might just feel like exhaustion lifting slightly, like your mind is a little less crowded, like you're not carrying as much emotional weight every hour of the day. And then gradually your attention starts coming back to yourself. You begin to notice how much energy was actually going into maintaining something unstable, how much emotional effort it took just to stay connected to someone who wasn't consistently meeting you halfway. The constant analyzing, the waiting, the hoping, the emotional self-regulation, it all starts to feel clearer in hindsight. Without that ongoing tension, you start to reclaim parts of yourself that were quietly put on hold. Your focus returns, your thoughts feel less fragmented. Even your body can start to feel lighter, as if it's no longer bracing for the next emotional shift. And over time, what once felt like punishment can begin to feel different. The silence is no longer just absence, it becomes space. Space to think without pressure, space to feel without reaction, space to step outside of a dynamic that kept pulling you into uncertainty. That's often where perspective starts to form. You begin to see the relationship more clearly, not just through emotion, but through patterns. The imbalance becomes easier to recognize. How much emotional effort you were giving compared to what you were receiving. How often you were the one bridging distance. How much of your inner world was shaped around someone who wasn't fully meeting you in return. And slowly, something important happens. The silence stops feeling like something that is happening to you and starts becoming something that is happening for you. Not because the situation is ideal, but because it finally gives you enough distance to see yourself again. This is where detachment becomes real. Not as a performance, not as a reaction meant to trigger someone else, but as a quiet internal shift where your sense of self is no longer dependent on their participation. It's the moment where your focus starts moving away from will they come back and towards something more grounded. What was I actually experiencing in this connection, and what do I need moving forward? And while that shift is happening internally for you, the other side of silence can also unfold in its own way for them. When someone relies heavily on emotional distance as a way of staying regulated, absence can eventually bring up feelings they don't immediately process: loneliness, reflection, or unexpected memories. Not always in a clear or direct way, but in fragments. A thought here, a memory there, a brief emotional pull that appears and disappears again. Sometimes there can be curiosity about what you're doing, sometimes nostalgia for how things used to feel in the beginning, and sometimes an internal conflict between wanting connection and wanting to stay protected from it. But even if there is a return at some point, it often comes cautiously, indirectly, without full emotional clarity. A message that feels light on the surface but carries underlying testing, an attempt to see if access still exists, if familiarity can be reactivated, if the old dynamic can still be reached. And this is where your awareness becomes different than before. Because by this point, you're not engaging from the same emotional place anymore. The pull is weaker, the confusion is lower, the pattern is more visible. What once felt intense or uncertain now feels familiar in a way that is easier to recognize rather than get lost in. And that clarity brings you to a turning point, not one defined by their behavior, but by your response to it. Not based on hope, not based on potential, and not based on the version of them you imagined they could become if everything finally aligned, but based on what they are consistently showing you right now, through behavior that doesn't require interpretation, just observation. When someone with avoidant tendencies genuinely engages in inner work and reaches back out after a period of silence, there is usually a noticeable difference in tone and responsibility. You don't just get vague reappearances or emotionally neutral check-ins. You see some level of ownership. They acknowledge the distance instead of pretending it didn't matter. They reflect on what happened instead of avoiding the topic entirely. Even if they don't have perfect clarity, there is at least a willingness to step toward discomfort rather than around it. There's effort to reconnect in a way that includes emotional reality, not just familiarity. But when the return is shallow, when it comes in the form of "hey stranger" messages, casual check-ins that lead nowhere, or surface-level conversations that carefully avoid anything meaningful, that also tells you something important without needing interpretation. It shows you a pattern, not a promise. It says in its own quiet way, "I can remember you. I can feel something when I think about you. I can miss the comfort of what we had. But I'm not currently willing to engage with the deeper emotional responsibility that real intimacy requires." And that distinction matters more than timing, silence length, or strategy ever will. Because this is not a game of waiting correctly or saying the right thing at the right moment. This is about capacity, emotional capacity, relational willingness, the ability to tolerate vulnerability without retreating when it becomes uncomfortable. No amount of silence can manufacture that capacity, and no amount of chasing can create it either. What often gets overlooked in these dynamics is that your real shift in power doesn't come from using silence as leverage. It comes from something quieter and more internal. The moment you stop using connection as a way to prove your worth. The moment you stop reaching, not because you are trying to trigger a reaction, but because you no longer need one to feel secure in yourself. That is when silence changes meaning. It stops being a strategy and starts becoming a state of self-respect. And in that state, your absence is no longer about absence at all. It becomes clarity. It communicates that access to you is no longer automatic. That emotional inconsistency is no longer something you participate in. That your attention is no longer something someone can assume they will always have, regardless of how they show up. For some people, that realization becomes a turning point. It disrupts old patterns enough that they begin to reflect, question, and eventually change. They start recognizing that closeness does not have to equal loss of self, and that avoidance does not actually protect them from emotional consequences, it only delays them. For others, the response is different. They move toward distraction, new environments, new people, new routines, anything that allows them to avoid sitting with the discomfort that silence brings up. Not because you weren't meaningful, but because facing emotional depth feels overwhelming in that moment. And that distinction is important to accept without turning it into self-blame. Because none of that response is something you could have controlled through better communication, more patience, or different timing. It reflects their internal readiness, not your value. In both cases, silence becomes something like a mirror. It doesn't just show you whether they return or not. It shows you what kind of relationship dynamic was actually forming underneath everything, the effort balance, the emotional responsibility, and the space you had to abandon yourself in order to keep it going. And it also shows you something equally important, who you are when you are no longer trying to hold something together alone. So, where you are right now in this silence is not just a waiting period, it is a point of clarity beginning to form quietly, gradually, and often long before anything externally changes. And at this point, the real question is no longer whether they will eventually reach out. The real question becomes much deeper than that. It shifts away from their behavior and turns inward toward you, toward what is actually unfolding inside you during this silence. Are you using this space as a real opportunity to heal, to rebuild your emotional boundaries, to reconnect with your own needs that may have been pushed aside in the relationship, and to strengthen the sense of self-worth that slowly erodes when you're constantly overgiving just to keep someone emotionally close? Or are you still stuck in that in-between state, emotionally paused, waiting, hoping, holding your breath as if your inner stability depends on whether they return or not? Because this is where the real transformation either begins or doesn't. Not in the outcome of contact, not in who sends the first message, not in whether the silence is broken sooner or later, but in whether something genuinely changes within you while nothing external is happening. What actually shapes your future is not timing, it is not coincidence, it is not whether they suddenly realize your value or decide to come back. It is growth, it is emotional development, it is whether you are actively becoming someone who is no longer trapped in the same relational patterns, or whether you remain emotionally tied to them even in their absence. For you, silence can become something profoundly powerful if you allow it to serve that purpose. It can become a turning point where your attention slowly stops revolving around another person's availability and starts returning to your own life, your own needs, your own identity. It becomes a space where you begin to remember parts of yourself that were not dependent on this relationship, parts of you that existed before the emotional uncertainty took over so much mental and emotional space. And in that space, something important starts to happen. You begin to see more clearly, not just what happened in the relationship, but how it functioned. You start to notice patterns that were hard to see while you were inside them. How often you were the one initiating, the one repairing, the one adjusting, the one carrying emotional responsibility that should have been shared. You begin to recognize what you tolerated in the name of connection, what you ignored in the name of hope, what you kept trying to fix alone, even when it required two people to truly change the dynamic. And with that awareness comes something quietly transformative: choice. The ability to respond differently in the future instead of repeating what was familiar in the past. At the same time, silence is not only affecting you, it is also creating a very different internal environment for them. One that is no longer shaped by your presence, your pursuit, or your emotional availability. For them, silence can become something far more confronting. It can become a space where avoidance is no longer buffered by connection, where distraction is no longer supported by your engagement, and where emotional distance is no longer softened by your consistency. In that space, they are left more directly with themselves, with their patterns, their discomfort, and the parts of emotional connection they may not have fully developed or faced. And when someone who relies on emotional distance as a coping strategy is placed in that kind of space, the response can vary. Sometimes it leads to reflection, sometimes it leads to discomfort that pushes growth, sometimes it creates moments of realization that they cannot easily ignore anymore, but other times it leads to repetition, the same cycle, just in a different setting. New distractions, new connections, new environments, yet the same underlying avoidance of depth, vulnerability, and sustained emotional responsibility. And this is where a crucial misunderstanding often happens. Silence itself does not magically create change in a person. It does not fix someone. It does not guarantee awakening. It does not automatically transform avoidance into emotional availability. What silence actually does is reveal structure. It exposes what was already there underneath the interaction. It shows whether the connection was built on shared emotional responsibility or whether it was being maintained disproportionately by one person trying to hold everything together. Because if a relationship cannot function without constant pursuit from one side, constant reassurance, constant emotional compensation, then what is being revealed is not necessarily mutual connection. It may be imbalance disguised as attachment. And that realization can feel uncomfortable at first because it challenges the emotional narrative you may have been holding on to, but it is also where clarity begins to form. Because from that clarity comes an important truth. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You cannot sacrifice your emotional stability in the hope that it will eventually create stability in them. You cannot continuously overextend yourself and expect that imbalance to transform into security. Real connection does not require you to shrink yourself. It does not require you to silence your needs, question your intuition, or live in constant uncertainty about where you stand. It does not depend on one person chasing while the other withdraws. It does not thrive in inconsistency, emotional confusion, or cycles of anxiety and relief. Real connection is steadier than that. It is mutual in effort. It includes responsibility from both sides. It can handle discomfort without disappearing. It does not collapse every time emotional depth is required. So if this silence is doing anything meaningful, it is not just separating two people or delaying contact. It is revealing patterns that were already present. It is bringing emotional reality into focus, and it is quietly guiding you toward a clearer understanding of what you will no longer continue accepting. Because what you are being shown is not only how someone behaves when you stop reaching for them, but how you behave when you finally stop abandoning yourself in the process. And that is where the real shift happens. Not in whether they return, not in whether they change, not in whether the silence ends, but in who you become when you no longer need external validation to feel whole.